Last Christmas Eve, my family gathered at my parents' house, a small two-story home tucked into the safety of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Snow blanketed the lawns, and the street glowed with warm light from houses adorned in festive decorations. Inside, everything smelled like pine needles, cocoa, and cinnamon. The living room was cozy, cluttered with wrapping paper scraps and the laughter of my niece and nephew, who had spent the last hour playing a high-stakes game of who can stay awake until Santa comes. My dad was stoking the fire. My mom fussed with the ornaments on the tree. My sister leaned against the couch, humming "Deck the Halls," while her husband wrestled the kids into their pajamas. It was the kind of night that makes you think nothing bad could ever happen. Then the doorbell rang. "Expecting anyone?" my dad asked, glancing around the room. We all shook our heads. The kids looked up, curious. "Maybe it's carolers," Mom said, smiling. "How nice." Dad walked to the door. Through the frosted glass, we saw 3 figures standing on the porch. They were bundled up in mismatched scarves and beanies, holding what looked like songbooks. The porch light illuminated their breath in the cold air, little clouds of fog hanging over their heads. "It is carolers," Dad said. He opened the door without hesitation. The singing started immediately, but something about it felt off. Their voices were flat, mechanical, the kind of singing you do when you're not paying attention. None of them smiled. The woman, standing between 2 men, barely moved her lips. I noticed the tall man on the left glancing into the house, his dark eyes flicking over the living room like he was making an inventory. His jaw tensed as he sang, and his hands stayed jammed in his pockets. Dad clapped his hands when they finished the song. "Lovely. Thank you so much. Merry Christmas." He started to close the door, but the tall man stepped forward, placing a gloved hand on the doorframe. "Mind if we come in?" he asked, his voice low and rough, his mouth stretched into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's freezing out here." Dad hesitated, his hand tightening on the doorknob. Sorry, we're in the middle of a family night, but we appreciate the music." The man's smile vanished instantly. His face hardened, and for one horrifying moment, no one moved. Then he shoved the door open. The sound was sickening, a heavy crack as the edge of the door slammed into Dad's face. He staggered back, blood pouring from his nose, as the 3 strangers pushed their way inside. The woman was holding a knife. The shorter man had a gun. The tall man, the one with the scar peeking out from under his scarf, closed the door behind them and locked it. My mom screamed. My sister froze, her face pale. The kids started crying, their high-pitched wails filling the room like sirens. "Phones, jewelry, money," the tall man barked. His voice was cold, controlled. "Now." Dad stumbled, clutching his face, his sweater already soaked with blood. "Look, just take what you want," he stammered, his voice muffled by his hand. "Where's your safe?" the woman demanded, her knife gleaming in the light from the Christmas tree. "We don't have one," Mom cried. Her hands were shaking so badly that the mug she'd been holding shattered on the floor. "Everyone in the living room," the shorter man growled. He waved the gun at us, his hand trembling. He wasn't calm like the tall man. He was nervous, and it terrified me more than anything else. We moved slowly, fear weighing down every step. Dad tried to wipe his face, but the blood kept coming. The intruders herded us toward the fireplace and forced us to sit on the rug. "Keep the kids quiet," the woman snapped. She pointed the knife at my sister. "Please don't hurt them," my sister begged, pulling her daughter into her lap. The little girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her tiny body trembling. The tall man stepped over us, towering like a shadow. He grabbed a stocking from the mantel and tore it open, dumping out candy and trinkets onto the floor. Then he started rifling through the drawers, yanking them out and tossing their contents everywhere. The woman moved to the tree, slashing through ribbons and shaking wrapped boxes, cursing under her breath when she didn't find anything valuable. Ornaments crashed to the floor, shattering into shards of glittering glass. The shorter man paced, his hand twitching around the gun. "Hurry up," he muttered, glancing at the door. "We're wasting time." "This place is a joke," the woman hissed, throwing a porcelain angel across the room. The tall man turned to Dad. "Where's your car?" "The keys. They're in the kitchen," Dad said quickly, his voice shaking. "Go get them," the tall man ordered the short one. When he left, the tall man crouched down in front of Dad. His smile returned, but it was worse than before. Too wide, too deliberate. The lights flickered suddenly, just for a moment. "What the hell was that?" the woman snapped, turning toward the tree. The tall man didn't answer. He just stared at Dad, his dark eyes unblinking. Then, in a low voice, he whispered, "Don't call the cops tonight, or we'll come back." Dad nodded, his whole body trembling. The short man returned with the keys. "Got 'em," he said, holding them up. "Let's go," the tall man said. As they moved toward the door, the lights flickered again. For just a second, I swear I saw something behind the tall man. A shape, hunched and shadowed, with two long arms. It was gone in the blink of an eye, leaving only the faint smell of sulfur behind. The intruders left as quickly as they'd come. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a moment, the house was silent except for the sound of the kids sobbing. No one moved. No one spoke. We waited until sunrise before we called the police. They said this wasn't unusual, that some criminals used the holidays as cover for home invasions. They promised to send officers to patrol the neighborhood, but they never caught them. It's been a year now, and I still hear the doorbell in my nightmares. Every time it rings, my stomach twists and my hands shake. Sometimes, though, I hear something else. Low, guttural whispers just beyond the glass, growing louder as I get closer. Christmas used to feel like magic. Now, it feels like a warning. If you're reading this, take my advice. Don't open the door for anyone you're not expecting, not even on Christmas Eve. I still can't escape that night. The memories are burned into my mind, replaying endlessly, haunting me every waking moment. Years have passed, yet every detail feels as vivid as if it happened yesterday. I've tried telling people, thinking it might help lighten the weight, but it never does. If anything, it only digs deeper, reminding me that some things cannot be explained or forgotten. It was Christmas Eve, 2017. My wife Sarah and I were driving home after spending the day at my sister's house. Our kids, Lucas and Emma, were asleep in the back seat, nestled under a blanket, their faces soft with the kind of innocence you only see in children. The air was cold, the roads slick with a thin sheet of ice. Light snow drifted lazily from the sky, covering everything in a fragile, deceptive stillness. The highway stretched out before us, empty and dark, save for the occasional glimmer of distant headlights. Around 10 p.m., we were 30 miles from home, the kind of stretch where civilization fades into nothing but trees and shadows. That's when I saw him, standing alone on the shoulder of the road. A man dressed in a Santa suit, waving one arm toward us. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Who stands out here, dressed like that, in the middle of nowhere? But there he was, unmistakable against the snowy backdrop, his red suit tattered and faded, the white trim darkened with grime. Next to him, an old car sat at an odd angle, one wheel sunk into the ditch, its hazard lights flickering weakly, almost like a dying heartbeat. "Do you see that?" I asked Sarah, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. She leaned forward, squinting into the dark. "Is he waving? That's weird." "Weird doesn't cover it," I said. But even as I spoke, I was already slowing down. Something deep inside me told me not to, but my instincts warred with my upbringing. My father had always taught me to help those in need, no matter what. Sarah glanced at me, her brow furrowed. "Do you think he's okay? Should we stop?" I hesitated, the car rolling to a near crawl. Everything about the situation screamed wrong. But what if he really needed help? What if it were me out there, stranded and alone, with no one willing to stop? "I'll check it out," I said finally, pulling onto the shoulder a few yards behind his car. The air in the car suddenly felt heavier, thick with unspoken doubt. I could feel Sarah's unease, mirrored by my own. I left the engine running and turned to her. "Keep the doors locked. Don't let the kids wake up." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Be careful." The man turned as I stepped out, his face lighting up with what looked like relief. He started walking toward me, his boots crunching softly against the thin layer of snow. Up close, he looked even worse. The suit was filthy, the fabric torn in places, revealing patches of bare skin reddened by the cold. His face was pale, his eyes sunken but bright, like he hadn't slept in days. And that smile, it stretched across his face, too wide, too forced, as though it had been plastered there for hours. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his voice warm but strained. "Most people just keep driving." I stopped a few feet away, my hands shoved into my coat pockets. "What's going on? Car trouble?" He nodded quickly, gesturing toward the car. "Flat tire. I don't have a spare. I was hoping someone might stop and give me a hand." I glanced at the car. Something about the way it was positioned seemed off, like it hadn't just rolled into the ditch. It had been placed there. My gut twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Let me take a look," I said, walking toward the rear of the vehicle. The man stepped back, watching me closely. His eyes darted to the road, then to my car, and then back to me. That's when I noticed his hands. They were trembling, not from the cold, but from something else. Anxiety. Anticipation. I knelt by the tire, my breath fogging in the icy air. The rubber looked fine, no punctures, no damage. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a flat tire. This was a trap. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding. Before I could turn, I heard footsteps behind me, fast, heavy, deliberate. A surge of adrenaline shot through me, and I spun around just in time to see a figure lunging out of the darkness. He was dressed in black, a ski mask covering his face, his gloved hands reaching for me. I stumbled backward, shouting, my voice cutting through the silence like a gunshot. "Sarah, lock the doors!" The man in black grabbed at my arm, his grip like iron. I struggled, kicking wildly, my boots slipping on the icy ground. From the corner of my eye, I saw two more figures emerge from the shadows, both dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured. One of them moved toward my car. Panic took over. I lashed out, twisting and clawing, desperate to break free. My fist connected with something solid, the side of the attacker's head, and he let go, staggering backward. I didn't wait for him to recover. I turned and bolted toward my car, my legs burning, my breath ragged. Behind me, the Santa guy was shouting, his voice frantic, but I couldn't make out the words. Sarah had already thrown the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the slick road. I yanked open the passenger door and dove inside. "Go! Drive!" I screamed. The car lurched forward, the headlights cutting through the darkness as we sped away. I looked back, but the figures were already gone, swallowed by the shadows. The road stretched endlessly ahead of us, but my mind was racing, trapped in those moments, replaying every detail, every sound, every movement. We reached the nearest town and called the police. They searched the area but found nothing. No car, no attackers, no footprints in the snow. It was as if none of it had ever happened. The officers told us it was probably a scam, a roadside robbery gone wrong. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that they chose us. Somehow, they knew we would stop. So if you're ever out there, driving on an empty road, and you see someone in need, think twice. Because sometimes, helping isn't the right choice. Sometimes, the cost is too high. I don't pick up hitchhikers. It's a rule I've had for years, one I've always followed without question. But last Christmas Eve, I broke it. I wish I hadn't. I'd stayed too late at my parents' house trying to squeeze out the last bits of holiday cheer. By the time I left, it was nearly 11 p.m. Outside, the world was frozen solid. The air stung when I breathed, and the roads were empty. Nothing but long black stretches of highway and dim lights in the distance. About halfway through the drive, I saw him. A man in a Santa suit standing on the shoulder, holding out his thumb. I almost laughed. For a moment it seemed ridiculous, like something out of a cheap Christmas movie. But as I got closer, the laughter died in my throat. He wasn't smiling. His face was pale, his beard stained, and he looked wrong. Not drunk, not crazy, just wrong. Like something in him didn't fit quite right. I didn't plan on stopping, but as I drove past, I caught a glimpse of his eyes in my mirror. They were wide and desperate, fixed on my taillights like a drowning man watching a life raft float away. I should have kept driving. Instead, I slowed down. Maybe it was the cold or the guilt of leaving someone out there on Christmas Eve. I don't know. I rolled to a stop, my tires crunching over the ice. Before I even rolled down my window, he was already jogging toward me. "Thanks, man," he said. His voice was breathless, raspy. "Car died a few miles back. Just need a lift to the next town." He didn't wait for permission. He yanked the passenger door open, climbed in, and dropped a filthy bag onto his lap. My stomach tightened. His Santa suit looked worse up close. The white trim was smeared with dark streaks, not mud, not grease. I kept telling myself it didn't matter. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "Gas station up the road," he said. "That's good enough." I nodded and pulled back onto the highway. The car felt too quiet. The heater hissed softly, but it wasn't enough to cover the sound of my own breathing. Every few seconds, I glanced at him from the corner of my eye. He was staring out the window, one hand resting on the bag. "Long night?" I asked, just to fill the silence. He smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Something like that. I didn't ask any more questions. We drove in silence for 15 minutes. I kept my focus on the road, but I could feel him watching me. The bag sat on his lap, bulging at odd angles. The fabric stretched in strange shapes. I didn't want to look at it, but my eyes kept drifting back. Something about it made my skin crawl. "Mind if I ask what's in the bag?" I said finally, trying to sound casual. His head turned slowly. For the first time, his eyes met mine. They were dull and flat, like two coins at the bottom of a well. "Just some things I need," he said. I didn't ask again. The gas station appeared up ahead, its neon lights flickering against the darkness. Relief washed over me. The parking lot was empty except for an old sedan parked near the pumps. I pulled in and put the car in park. "We're here," I said. He didn't move. For a long moment, he just sat there staring straight ahead. Then, without warning, he grabbed the bag and opened the door. The air rushed in, bitter and cold. "Thanks for the ride," he said. "No problem." He stood outside for a moment, his back to me. Then he turned, looked through the open door, and said something I'll never forget. "You should be careful who you stop for." He didn't wait for a response. He swung the bag over his shoulder and started walking. He didn't head for the gas station. Instead, he slipped around the side of the building and vanished into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the wheel. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong, like I'd just dodged something I couldn't name. Finally, I climbed out of the car and went inside. The clerk barely looked up when I walked in. She was a young woman, maybe early 20s, scrolling through her phone behind the counter. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, glancing out the window. "Just dropped someone off out front, guy in a Santa suit." She froze. Her fingers hovered above the screen. "Santa suit?" she repeated. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" Her face went pale. She turned slowly and pointed toward a bulletin board near the door. I followed her finger and felt my stomach drop. The board was cluttered with missing persons flyers and local notices. In the center, pinned with two bright red tacks, was a photo of a man in a Santa suit. His eyes were wide and desperate, just like they'd been on the road. Wanted for questioning in connection to a homicide, considered armed and dangerous. I couldn't breathe. "Did he go inside?" she asked quietly. "No," I said. My voice sounded far away. "He went around back." We both turned to the window. Outside, the lot was empty. The old sedan was gone, the pumps silent. I felt cold all over. I thought of his bag, the strange weight of it. I thought of the dark streaks on his suit. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment over and over. Next time, I'll keep driving. I live in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where people know each other's names, and where the biggest event of the year is the Christmas lights competition. It's meant to be fun, right? Nothing more than neighbors showing off their creativity with a bit of holiday spirit. People love to talk about their plans, post photos of their progress, and brag about how grand their display is going to be. But there was one guy, Kevin, who took it way too seriously. It wasn't just about the lights for him. It was like he treated it as a personal challenge. Every year, he'd talk about his plans in a way that made you feel like he needed to win. I'd always thought he was just competitive, but looking back, I realize now how wrong I was. At first, things seemed normal. The usual chatter, the usual excitement, and then the first pranks started. At least that's what I thought they were. My extension cords kept going missing. Sometimes, my bulbs were swapped out for cheap ones, like someone was trying to sabotage my display without making it too obvious. It was frustrating, but honestly, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just kids being dumb or maybe someone else getting overly competitive. But then, after I'd spent hours setting up my lights and I was finally proud of the display, something happened. Everything stopped working. At first, I figured it was a blown fuse, no big deal. But when I checked my wiring, I found that it wasn't just a fuse. Several connections had been cut, cleanly cut, as if someone knew exactly what they were doing. I was pissed, but it didn't end there. A few days later, my neighbor Lisa across the street mentioned that her display had been acting up too. Lights malfunctioning, timers being tampered with. We chalked it up to bad luck at first, but something about it felt wrong, too coordinated. Then, the letter came. It was in my mailbox, wedged between some junk mail. No return address, just a plain envelope and inside, a single sheet of paper. I almost didn't read it. I didn't want to give whoever sent it the satisfaction, but my curiosity got the better of me. The message was simple, but it made my stomach drop. You're not going to win. Not this year. If you keep trying to outshine me, you'll regret it. At first I thought it was just some sick joke, maybe one of the local kids or someone else who felt threatened. But as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a prank. Something about it felt personal. It escalated quickly. One evening, I was checking on my lights after dinner, and that's when I noticed it. It was late, dark, and eerily quiet. As I stepped outside, it hit me, the feeling of being watched. I looked over at Kevin's house, and that's when I saw it. His lights. They were flashing in a way that didn't look right. It wasn't just a malfunction. It almost looked like they were flickering in response to me, like they were staring. I couldn't explain why, but I had this gut feeling that I needed to investigate. So I walked over, and that's when I noticed something that made my heart race. There was a long wire running from his house, trailing across my yard. I couldn't believe it. He'd siphoned power from my house. I walked along the wire, and it led me straight to my own setup. My lights were connected to his system, running off his electricity instead of mine. I don't know why, but in that moment, something clicked. Kevin wasn't just competing, he was trying to destroy everyone around him. His need to win had turned into something dark, obsessive. The next day, I confronted him. He acted so casual about it, all smiles, like I was the one overreacting. He denied everything, said it was all a misunderstanding. But I knew this wasn't some mistake. That night, I stayed up late, watching my lights. I figured if he was behind it, he'd come back. And sure enough, around 2 a.m., I saw a figure in my yard. It was Kevin, lurking in the shadows, crouching down near my setup. I didn't hesitate. I ran outside to confront him, but by the time I got to my yard, he was gone. I looked around, heart pounding, and then I saw the damage. My entire display was ruined, wires cut, bulbs missing, my yard trampled. But the worst part? Kevin's lights were shining as brightly as ever, like nothing had happened. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just after a title. He was obsessed. He'd crossed a line and there was no going back. I didn't stick around much longer after that. I couldn't. The paranoia was overwhelming. The thought of him showing up again, of my property being destroyed again, was too much to handle. I packed up and moved a week later. Now, every time I drive by that neighborhood, I can't help but look at Kevin's house. His lights are always on, brighter than ever. And sometimes, when I'm driving past, I wonder, does he still do it? Is he still out there, watching, sabotaging anyone who dares challenge him? Maybe he never stopped. I still get that same sick feeling whenever I step into a store, especially around the holidays. It started at a department store in the mall, right around Christmas. You know the type. Overcrowded, bright lights, the constant buzz of holiday music, the usual chaos. I was there to grab a few last-minute gifts. The aisles were packed with people, and I was just trying to get through it as quickly as I could. Near the center of the store, they had one of those holiday displays. Santa's workshop, the whole deal. Fake snow, cheesy decorations, people in elf costumes. There was a long line of parents with kids waiting to get photos with the elves. I was never into that stuff, but I ended up waiting near the setup anyway. My sister was off picking up something from another store, and I didn't have much else to do. That's when I noticed him. One of the elves was standing by the display, handing out little coupons for discounts. He was wearing a big green suit and had these fake pointed ears that looked like they were made of cheap plastic. Nothing really stood out at first, except for how off he seemed. He wasn't just mingling with people. He was hovering. Not just casually handing out coupons, but lingering. And not in the holiday cheer way you might expect from someone working that job. He approached an older woman, probably in her 60s, who had just made a purchase. He handed her a coupon, smiled at her, and then he just stayed there for way too long. I noticed him glance at her purse. She didn't seem to notice. I wasn't sure what to think at first. Maybe he was just a little too eager to make a sale, or maybe I was overthinking it. But something about his body language felt wrong. I didn't let it go, though. I kept watching him. He was being too careful. The next person he approached was a younger guy, maybe late 20s. He handed him a coupon the same way, but this time, I saw something that made my stomach drop. As they exchanged pleasantries, the elf hugged the guy briefly, and as he did, he slipped his hand into the guy's coat pocket. Not a casual pat, but a deliberate motion. When they broke apart, the elf stepped away with a kind of practiced nonchalance, as though he'd done this countless times. That's when I knew. I wasn't just seeing a creepy holiday mascot. This guy was stealing from people. I couldn't prove it yet, but my gut told me this wasn't some innocent elf playing a part. Something about the way he moved, the way he interacted, it was too controlled. I told my sister what I'd seen. She just shrugged it off, muttering that I was probably overthinking it, or that it was some kind of weird misunderstanding. But I couldn't shake it. I kept watching him. And the more I did, the more I saw the same pattern repeat itself. He was careful. He was methodical. The next time I saw him, he was targeting a woman with a stroller. She was distracted, talking to someone on her phone, while he was just a little too close. He nudged the stroller as he approached her, made some small talk, handed her a coupon, and then moved on. I immediately checked her bag. Her wallet was gone. It had happened so fast, I almost couldn't believe it. He was moving from person to person, always picking the distracted ones. It was like he knew exactly who to target. That was when I decided to act. I called store security, trying to be as casual as possible. I didn't want to spook him or make it obvious that I was watching. But as soon as I hung up the phone, I felt the weight of the situation settle in my chest. The elf had noticed me watching. He knew. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again. This time, he gave me a look. It was subtle, but it was there. The kind of look you give someone when you realize they're onto you. His eyes lingered on me for just a second too long, and I could feel my heart rate spike. Then, he bolted. I don't know how he did it. He wasn't running exactly, but it was like he moved through the crowd with an unnatural speed. Security must have noticed, because they were chasing after him almost immediately, but he was already too far ahead. I was right behind them when he reached one of the store's exits, but by the time I got there, he was gone. The doors were closing, and the security guards were standing there, confused and out of breath, looking at each other like they didn't know what had just happened. The whole thing felt unreal. But then the worst part came. When security reviewed the store footage, they found the elf had been doing this for days, weeks even. He'd been working as part of the holiday display, using his position to steal from customers. There were multiple people who'd had their wallets stolen, all picked off during the holiday rush, all without realizing it until it was too late. The thing is, because he was dressed as an elf, no one thought to question him. No one even suspected that the friendly guy handing out coupons might be a criminal. It was genius, in a way. He blended in perfectly. But what really chilled me was something I didn't find out until later. The police had never been called. The store didn't issue a public statement, didn't make any announcements. It was as if they were trying to sweep it under the rug. Maybe it was to avoid bad press during the busy season. Or maybe they didn't want to draw attention to the fact that their own security had been completely duped by a guy in a ridiculous elf costume. Either way, they didn't act like it was a big deal. I couldn't stop thinking about how many people had probably been victimized before I noticed. How many others had been stolen from without ever knowing what happened. And now, every time I see some cheesy holiday display, some guy in a ridiculous costume, I can't shake the feeling that there's always something more going on behind the scenes. It could be anyone, any one of those actors smiling and waving, handing out coupons. How many other people like that elf are out there, blending in, hiding in plain sight? I don't trust any of them anymore. I never thought anything could ruin Christmas, but I also never thought we'd spend Christmas morning looking over our shoulders. What happened to my family that year still keeps me up some nights, and I don't think we'll ever feel safe again. It started small, barely noticeable in the moment. Looking back, I should have realized sooner. The signs were there, little things, easy to dismiss. But it wasn't until Christmas Eve that everything came together, and by then, it was too late. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone knows everyone else. Christmas here is a big deal. Houses lined with lights, wreaths on doors, trees glowing in every window. Ours was no exception. My parents always went all out for the holidays. That year, they hosted Christmas Eve dinner for the extended family, which meant the house was packed. I spent most of the day helping my mom set up while my dad kept an eye on my younger brother. It was around 6 in the evening when my mom first noticed something strange. Someone had knocked on the front door, but when she opened it, no one was there. She called out a tentative hello into the cold, empty street, but there was no response. She shrugged it off as kids playing pranks. At the time, it felt harmless. We laughed about it, joked that our neighbors' kids were probably testing out a new way to be annoying, and went back to cooking and decorating. Dinner that night was loud and chaotic. My aunt was telling a story that had everyone in stitches. My brother was busy playing with a remote control car in the living room, and I was doing the dishes when something caught my eye. The kitchen window overlooked the street, and just past the glow of our outdoor lights, I saw a figure standing on the sidewalk. They were perfectly still, not pacing or looking at their phone, just standing there. I couldn't make out their face. It was too dark, but I knew they were facing the house. My stomach tightened as I watched them, half expecting them to wave or move. But they didn't. When I blinked, they were gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had walked by, paused, and then kept going. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. By the time dinner ended, I had almost forgotten about it. The house was quieter now. The adults were chatting over coffee. My brother had gone to bed, and I headed upstairs to grab my phone from my room. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the Christmas lights outside. I walked past my bedroom window and froze. There they were again, the same figure from earlier, but closer this time. They were on the sidewalk directly in front of our house, just standing there watching. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I ducked out of sight, pressing myself against the wall. My hands were shaking as I crept back to the window and peeked out again. They hadn't moved. I rushed downstairs to tell my dad. He grabbed a flashlight and walked to the living room window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out. I stayed a few steps behind him, my pulse racing. "There's no one there," he said after a moment, his voice calm but tight. He shut the curtain and locked the door before calling the non-emergency police line. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They checked the area and walked up and down the street but found nothing. One officer reassured us it was probably just someone passing through, maybe a neighbor or a delivery driver. They told us to lock our doors and windows and not to worry, but I was worried. I couldn't stop thinking about how still the figure had been, how deliberate their movements seemed, or lack of movement, really. They weren't walking, they weren't delivering anything. They were just there. The rest of the night was quiet. My parents tucked us into bed, and I tried to sleep, but every noise made me jump. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining that figure outside the house, just standing there, waiting for something. The next morning, we woke up to the usual Christmas chaos. Wrapping paper flying, coffee brewing, carols playing in the background. For a few hours, everything felt normal again. Until I went to the kitchen. The window over the sink was covered in frost, but something on the outside caught my eye. There was a folded piece of paper on the ledge, held in place by a small rock. My stomach churned as I unlocked the window and reached out to grab it. The note was written in sloppy, jagged handwriting. 5 words. "I've been watching you," I screamed. My dad ran into the room, grabbing the note from my hands. His face went pale as he read it, and he immediately went to check the security cameras we'd installed around the house. The footage was worse than I could have imagined. The person had been walking around our house for weeks. They knew when we were home, when we weren't. On one clip, they stood at the edge of our yard, staring up at my bedroom window. On another, they walked up to the back door and stood there motionless for nearly an hour. But the worst part was from the night before Christmas. The figure was standing on our porch, staring directly into the camera, and then they smiled. We moved 2 months later. I don't know who they were, what they wanted, or if they're still out there. All I know is that every Christmas since, I keep the curtains closed and the lights off. I'd rather be invisible than watched. Every year, my family gathers at my parents' house for Christmas. My mom is the perfect host, turning the house into something out of a catalog. She wraps every gift like it belongs in a department store display and sets a dining table worthy of a magazine cover. The rest of us just fall into our roles. Rachel, my older sister, brings her kids, who always misbehave. Kyle, my younger brother, shows up late and drunk or hungover. My dad camps out in his recliner, pretending to watch football. and only moves when my mom tells him to carve the turkey. This Christmas started the same as all the others. I got there early to help my mom, who was already stressed out. She snapped at me when I moved a centerpiece a fraction of an inch. My dad sat in his usual spot, holding his beer like it was the only thing tethering him to this world. They weren't talking much. I didn't think anything of it, just the usual holiday tension. By the time dinner rolled around, everyone was on edge. Rachel was lecturing her kids about table manners, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Kyle was cracking jokes no one found funny except him. My mom tried to keep the mood light, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. My dad, usually the quiet observer, seemed different. He wasn't just silent, he was somewhere else entirely. His eyes stayed fixed on his plate like he was avoiding something. Halfway through dinner, Rachel couldn't help herself. She asked Kyle if he was still unemployed, her tone dripping with condescension. Kyle shot back that at least he wasn't stuck in a miserable marriage. The table fell silent, except for the clink of Rachel's fork against her plate. This was normal for us, a little family bickering before dessert. Then my dad spoke. Enough. He didn't yell, but the force behind his voice was enough to make Rachel drop her fork. He looked up, his face calm but his eyes burning. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. Let's put everything on the table. The room froze. My mom's hand trembled as she reached for her glass of wine. Not now, she said, her voice tight. My dad ignored her and turned to Rachel. You think you know everything, he said. Why don't you ask your mom about her friend from work? The room shifted. It wasn't just awkward anymore. It was suffocating. Rachel blinked, confused. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice uncertain for the first time all night. My dad leaned back in his chair, folding his arms like he'd been waiting for this moment. Go ahead, ask her. My mom's face crumpled. She begged him to stop, but Rachel wasn't letting it go. She demanded answers, her voice rising with every word until my mom broke. She admitted it. She'd been having an affair for years. Rachel's face twisted with rage. She screamed at my mom, calling her a liar, a hypocrite. Kyle, always quick to pick sides, stood up and joined in. He called her names I'd never heard him use before, his voice shaking with anger. My mom tried to defend herself, but she was sobbing too hard to get the words out. Then she turned to my dad. Tell them about her, she spat, her voice raw. For a second, my dad didn't move. Then he stood up, towering over the table. Fine, he said, his voice cold. You want the truth? I've been seeing someone too. Rachel let out a sound that didn't even seem human. She stood up so fast her chair tipped over and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Kyle's hands were shaking as he started grabbing things off the table, plates, glasses, whatever he could reach, and hurling them against the wall. The sound of shattering glass filled the room. My mom was crying so hard she could barely breathe, and my dad just stood there, watching it all like he wasn't a part of it. Then Kyle grabbed the carving knife. He pointed it at my dad, his hand trembling. You ruined everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. My dad stared at him unflinching. Do it, he said. His voice was calm, almost bored. You'll prove you're just like me. Kyle's grip tightened on the knife. For a second, I thought he was going to do it. Then the knife slipped from his hand and hit the floor. The sound was dull, but it echoed in my head like a gunshot. Nobody said anything after that. Kyle stumbled out of the room, and I stayed frozen in my seat. My mom was still crying, and my dad just walked away. He didn't even look back. That was the last Christmas we spent together. Rachel moved across the country and blocked all our numbers. Kyle started drinking even more than before, and my parents finally separated. I haven't spoken to any of them in years. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I'm back in that dining room. I see Kyle holding the knife. I see my mom breaking down. I see my dad's empty, lifeless stare. It wasn't just a bad Christmas. It was the moment everything shattered. The house felt alive that night, like it had been waiting for us to tear ourselves apart. Holidays aren't supposed to feel this way, but for me, they always will. It was Christmas Eve 3 years ago. Our family was hosting the annual holiday party, a tradition we'd finally revived after the long, isolating pandemic. The house was alive with warmth and chaos. Kids darting through the hallways, wrapping paper scattered across the floor, and the hum of a dozen overlapping conversations filling the rooms. Everyone seemed eager to make up for lost time. A last-minute addition to the festivities was a hired Santa for the kids. My sister's friend vouched for him, saying he was a part-time mall Santa who could squeeze in a quick visit before heading to another gig. He arrived exactly on time, his red suit slightly frayed, but his demeanor cheerful enough to win over the children immediately. His deep laugh carried over the chatter as he handed out candy canes and posed for endless photos by the tree. My niece Clara, 7 years old and endlessly curious, was particularly taken with him. She peppered him with questions about the North Pole, his reindeer, and Mrs. Claus baking. He played along seamlessly, answering every query with a chuckle and a twinkle in his eye. Looking back, I realize he never once broke character, never once slipped up. At the time, I thought it made him professional. Now, I think it made him dangerous. Around 9:30 p.m., the party began to wind down. Parents bundled their kids into coats, and adults started picking up stray plates and cups. It was in this flurry of goodbyes that someone noticed Clara wasn't in the living room. "She's probably upstairs with the other kids," I said, trying to sound casual, even as unease curled in my stomach. My brother-in-law volunteered to check, but returned moments later, his face pale. "She's not up there," he said quietly. A slow, creeping panic settled over the room. We searched everywhere, the backyard, the basement, the garage. Her name was shouted over and over, each call met with an increasingly oppressive silence. Someone finally mentioned they'd last seen her by the front door with Santa. I rushed outside, heart hammering. The street was empty, the snow falling in heavy, soundless drifts. Most of the houses were dark, their holiday lights extinguished for the night. His car, a battered, rust-speckled sedan I hadn't given a second thought earlier, was gone. We called the police immediately. They arrived quickly, but it already felt too late. Neighbors were woken and questioned, but no one had seen anything. The Santa we'd hired had given us a fake name and a burner phone number. Even the mall he supposedly worked at had no record of him. The trail was ice cold before it had even started. Christmas Day came with no answers, only grief. Police officers knocked on doors, combed through surveillance footage, and followed every lead they could find. Weeks turned into months. Clara's face appeared on every lamppost, every news broadcast, and every missing child alert. But there was nothing, no trace of her, no sign of the man who had taken her. It was as if they'd both vanished into the snow that night. I replay that evening in my mind constantly. I see the moment she followed him to the front door, her little hand tucked in his. I hear her laugh, so carefree as she walked away. And I remember the chaotic, crowded house full of adults who somehow missed what was happening right in front of them. We don't celebrate Christmas anymore. The lights stay boxed up, the tree stays in storage, and the presents go unbought. Every year, I'm haunted by the thought of Clara, out there somewhere, wondering why we haven't found her. If you're reading this, and you're planning a holiday party this year, take a good look at the man in the Santa suit. Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones we should fear the most. My family always follows the same tradition. We put up the tree on the 23rd, and the 24th is reserved for decorating it together. We've been doing this for years. Our house is the first one on the street, right on the corner, so it's impossible not to see the huge tree through the window. Each year, it gets bigger, brighter, and we all love it. I never thought anyone could possibly resent that, but I was wrong. We live in a quiet neighborhood, one of those suburban streets where everyone knows everyone's business, but acts like they don't. Our house is at the corner of the street, where people tend to linger a little longer, and we often wave at the neighbors. The warm lights from our tree always lit up the front window, a beacon of holiday cheer. I never gave it much thought until he started giving us those strange looks. Mr. Bellamy lives next door. He's an older guy, mid-60s, lives alone. He doesn't have any family, no kids, no wife, just him and his bitterness. At first, I thought he was just a grumpy old man, the kind of person who doesn't care for the loud festivities of the holidays. But something about him changed over the past few years. It was subtle at first. The way he'd glare at us when we waved, the way he slammed his door a little too forcefully when we said hi. At first, I shrugged it off. People are just weird sometimes, right? But then on Christmas Eve, something shifted. I had just fallen asleep, still in the glow of the Christmas tree lights. The faint hum of holiday music still echoed from the living room, a sound I had grown so used to I didn't even notice it anymore. I didn't realize how tired I was until my eyes fluttered open at around 2 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure why I woke up. Maybe it was a bad dream. Maybe the tree lights were too bright. But when I opened my eyes, I saw the glow coming through the curtains. I thought it was just the reflection of the lights on the glass. But then I realized something was terribly wrong. The light was too bright, too intense. It wasn't just the tree, it was something else. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, and pulled the curtains back just enough to see. The entire tree was on fire. Not just the tree, but the whole living room. Flames licking up the walls, curling around the wooden beams. It was so fast it looked like the house was melting. The heat pushed against the window, even though I was several feet away. I screamed. It didn't feel real. Fires don't spread like that in movies. Not like this. Not in real life. It was like something out of a nightmare, the fire spreading across the room in seconds. The tree was just a mass of flames. My first thought was to run to my parents' room. I slammed open the door, shaking them awake. "The house is on fire! Get up!" My mom's eyes widened in confusion, but I didn't stop. I grabbed them both by the arms and pulled them out of bed. The smoke was starting to fill the hallway, and I could already feel the heat seeping through the walls. It wasn't safe anymore. We ran downstairs, but as I passed the front door, I caught a glimpse of something in the yard. something moving. A shadow, fast and deliberate, ducking behind the bushes by the fence. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. But then I saw it again. A figure, too tall to be a trick of the light. I didn't even hesitate to dial 911, my hands trembling. My parents were frantically grabbing the fire extinguisher, but my eyes couldn't leave that shadow. It moved silently, like it knew exactly how to stay hidden, how to stay unnoticed. By the time the firefighters arrived, the fire was under control, but it was too late. The living room was a charred wreck. The tree, the ornaments, the festive decorations we had spent so much time on, reduced to nothing but ash. My parents were safe, but I couldn't stop thinking about the person outside. Someone had watched us burn. The investigation went quickly. The fire department ruled it as arson. We were told it was likely someone with a personal vendetta, but we had no idea who could want to harm us. I didn't believe it. Not until the police knocked on Mr. Bellamy's door a few days later. They found what they needed in his garage: gasoline, traces of the chemicals he had used to douse the tree, a gas can, half empty, tucked behind his workbench. It all pointed back to him. When they arrested him, I couldn't believe it. Mr. Bellamy, the man who'd lived next door all these years, who'd watched us from his window. He had been planning it for months, sneaking around, filling the air with resentment until he couldn't stand it anymore. Apparently, he hated Christmas, hated everything about it, the noise, the lights, the constant cheer, the way we decorated the tree every year, the way it reminded him of everything he didn't have. He never had the family we did. No one cared enough to decorate his house. The holidays were a reminder of his bitter solitude, and he couldn't stand it any longer. The worst part? He didn't even try to hide it. When the police confronted him, he just sat there, calm, quiet, almost like he was proud of what he'd done. He had carefully soaked the tree, the floor, the area around it in gasoline, knowing exactly how fast the fire would spread. He watched the flames consume our home, a silent spectator, probably from his window. He was arrested. They took him away, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes as they led him to the car. It wasn't regret, it wasn't fear, it was satisfaction. He had done what he wanted, and there was nothing more to it. He felt justified. Since that night, everything has felt different. The street feels quieter now, more tense. Every time I pass his house, I feel this knot in my stomach. It's like something's watching me from behind those blinds. The house feels wrong now, too. We rebuilt, but the walls are still scarred, and every time I look at the new tree, I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. I can't stop thinking about the way he stood there, watching us burn, proud of what he'd done. It was supposed to be a time for family, a time for joy. But because of one bitter, hateful person, it became a nightmare I can't escape. I never thought my Christmas Eve would end in terror. The evening started like any other holiday night, wrapping presents, sipping hot cocoa, and letting soft carols play in the background. The tree lights flickered unevenly, casting jittery shadows on the walls. My parents had already gone to bed, and the house was quiet, almost too quiet. I told myself the eerie silence was normal for the suburbs at night, but I couldn't shake the strange unease that settled in my chest. It started with a notification on my phone, a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Merry Christmas. We need to talk." My stomach tightened. I didn't need to guess who it was. My ex, Mark. The breakup in September had been messy. Screaming matches, threats, blocked numbers. I thought I'd locked every door to him, but somehow he'd slipped through. I didn't reply. Ignoring him was the only option. I set my phone face down on the coffee table, trying to refocus on the glowing tree. But before I could take a steadying breath, another notification buzzed. I'm outside. Open the door. I froze. My mind raced through every possibility. He didn't know where I was. I'd never told him I'd be staying with my parents for Christmas. I forced myself to peek through the blinds, hoping, praying, the driveway would be empty. But it wasn't. His car was parked at the curb, its dull paint unmistakable even in the faint light from the street lamp. My phone buzzed again. I see you. I dropped the blinds like they burned me. My hands trembled as I stepped back, clutching my phone so tightly it hurt. I texted my dad upstairs. My fingers moved clumsily, the words almost illegible. Mark is here. Lock your door. Calling 911. I hadn't even hit send when the knock came. Slow, purposeful. I flinched. The knock came again, harder this time. I backed toward the couch, my knees threatening to give out. I dialed 911, my voice barely a whisper as I explained the situation. The operator assured me someone was on the way, but her calm tone didn't make me feel safer. Is he inside? She asked. Not yet, I whispered. The knocking stopped. My heart raced as I strained to hear any sound, footsteps, movement, anything. Then came his voice. I just want to talk. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. That made it worse. His tone was calm, almost kind, like this was just a misunderstanding. I stayed crouched behind the couch, every muscle in my body rigid. You can't hide forever, he said, his voice now closer to the window. You know that, don't you? Glass shattered in the kitchen. The sound was so sharp I gasped involuntarily. My hand flew to my mouth as I fought to stay silent. He was inside. His footsteps were deliberate, each one heavier than the last as they crossed the hardwood floor. My parents were still upstairs. I could only hope they stayed hidden. You think you can ignore me? His voice was sharper now, his calm slipping. Something thudded against the wall, a picture frame maybe. The sound of glass breaking followed. I clenched my phone tighter. They're almost here, I whispered, though the operator was already gone, replaced by silence. I didn't know if I meant the police or my sanity. His breathing was louder now, unsteady and shallow. He was getting closer. You don't get to throw people away like garbage. I pressed myself tighter against the couch. My chest ached from holding my breath. His voice was so close now, I could feel the weight of it in the air. And then, salvation. Red and blue lights bathed the walls, their glow spilling into the living room. A car door slammed outside, followed by hurried voices. Come out now! A commanding voice shouted. Mark swore loudly. His footsteps were frantic as he bolted back toward the shattered glass door. I stayed where I was, paralyzed, until I heard the scuffle outside. The officers had caught him. I only allowed myself to exhale when one of them knocked on the front door, calling out to say it was safe. Mark had a knife in his jacket. They told me later he'd been drinking, though that wasn't what stuck with me. What stuck was the look on his face as they dragged him away. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He smiled when he saw me through the window. That night I didn't sleep. I still hear his voice sometimes, low and calm, echoing in my mind. You can't hide forever.